Eerie Unseen Wounds. Chapter 1. The Weight of Walking. The glass doors parted smooth and silent, letting in the afternoon light and a woman who had no reason to prepare herself for what was coming. That's how it works, you see. You don't walk into a store thinking today's the day someone decides you don't belong. You just walk in. Kamala Harris moved through the entrance like anyone with a simple errand. Pick up what you need, pay, leave. The store had that clean, bright feel of a place that wants your money but doesn't necessarily want you. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Aisles stretched long and orderly. Everything in its place. Everything labeled. Everything watched. She wasn't the only one shopping. There were others. Filling carts, checking phones, comparing prices the way people do when they're trying to make a dollar stretch. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of scene you'd forget 5 minutes after living it. But some people don't get to be ordinary. She reached for a product on the shelf. Just reached. Her fingers touched the packaging, turned it over, read the label. The same motion 1,000 hands had made that day in 1,000 stores across the country. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. Except the watching had already started. You learn to feel it before you see it. That shift in the air when someone's gaze lands on you different. Not the quick glance of strangers passing through shared space. Something else. Something that weighs. The kind of looking that isn't about seeing what you're doing, but about deciding what you must be. An employee stood 2 aisles over, pretending to straighten stock that didn't need straightening. His eyes cut sideways. Once, twice. A manager lingered near the customer service desk, arms crossed, watching the security monitors, but really watching one particular figure moving through the health and beauty section. The silence in that store wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. Kamala moved to the next aisle. She compared shampoo bottles, reading ingredients the way anyone might who cares what they put in their hair. Her movements were calm, measured. She had no reason to rush, no reason to perform innocence for an audience she didn't know she had. But they were there. A whisper slipped between 2 employees near the pharmacy. Not loud enough to hear the words, but the tone carried. That particular frequency of suspicion that needs no volume to transmit its meaning. One nodded toward the aisle where Kamala browsed. The other's expression shifted. That small tightening around the eyes that says, "I see it too." See what exactly? A woman shopping. A woman touching products she might purchase. A woman existing in a space designed for exactly that purpose. But the machinery of assumption runs on something other than logic. She picked up a bottle of lotion, examined it, set it down, picked up another. Behind her footsteps, casual, circling, maintaining distance but maintaining presence. The kind of following that isn't quite following because it stays just inside the boundary of deniability. The weight in the air grew heavier. This is the thing about humiliation in modern clothing. It doesn't announce itself. No signs, no shouting. Just the slow accumulation of glances. The strategic positioning of bodies, the unspoken agreement between employees that someone needs watching. And the someone is always the same someone, wearing different faces but carrying the same burden, the presumption of guilt in a body that hasn't earned the presumption of innocence. Kamala placed 2 items in her basket. The small plastic carrier hung from her arm, visible, obvious, held in plain sight the way people hold things they intend to pay for. But intention doesn't matter when interpretation has already been made. Another employee appeared at the end of the aisle, just standing there. No particular task, no apparent purpose, just occupying space in a way that blocked easy exit. The performance of vigilance. The theater of protection from a threat that existed only in their imagination, built on the foundation of her skin. She kept shopping. What else could she do? Storm out and confirm their suspicion that she had something to hide. Confront them and become the aggressive one they'd already decided she might be? The trap was built before she walked in, and every move she made now would be read through the lens they'd already ground and fitted. You learn this young if you're black in America. How to move smaller, speak softer, smile wider, prove constantly that you're not the thing they're afraid you are. How to swallow the anger that rises when you realize you're being watched not because of what you've done, but because of what you represent in someone else's frightened imagination. She reached the end of the aisle. The basket hung visible on her arm. She turned toward the checkout, her face neutral, her pace unchanged. That's when the security guard stepped forward, not running, not aggressive, just there, suddenly, with that particular professional friendliness that's really anything but friendly. The smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The tone that's polite on the surface but carries underneath it a question you didn't ask to be asked. "Excuse me, ma'am." 2 words, ordinary words. Words spoken 100 times a day in 100 stores to 100 customers with 100 legitimate reasons. But you know when it's different, you know. The store didn't stop moving around them. Other shoppers passed, their eyes sliding away, their pace quickening. The universal human instinct to avoid becoming part of someone else's uncomfortable moment. Everyone noticed. No one said anything. That's how it works. The air changed. The room understood before she needed to speak that something was happening here. Something that happens all the time but shouldn't. Something that would have embarrassed them if they had to name it out loud. So they didn't. Kamala stood still, basket visible, receipt yet to be written, products not yet paid for but not yet stolen either. She stood in that terrible in-between space where you haven't done anything wrong, but you're being treated as if you have. And the burden of proof somehow falls on you to demonstrate your innocence in a situation that should never have required demonstration. Is there a problem? Her voice steady, calm, the voice of someone who's been here before, in different stores, different situations, but always the same fundamental scene. The guard smiled that smile again. "Just need to check your bag, ma'am. Store policy." Store policy. The phrase that covers a multitude of sins. The excuse that makes discrimination sound like procedure. Around them, other shoppers moved freely to checkout, bags unchecked, baskets unquestioned. The policy, it seemed, was selective in its application. Some wounds don't bleed right away. Some just settle deep and start changing how you breathe. And here, we don't let silence erase what was lived through. Unseen wounds. Chapter 2. The performance of compliance. She could have made a scene. Lord knows she would have been justified. But there's a calculation black folks make every single day that others never have to factor into their arithmetic. Is this the hill? Is this the moment? What will standing up for yourself cost? And who sets the price? Kamala handed over the basket. Not because she had to, legally speaking, but because she understood the game being played and knew that refusal would be weaponized as evidence of guilt. The security guard took it with that same professional courtesy, that same smile, performing thoroughness for an audience of employees who watched from strategic distances. He examined each item, turned them over, checked for tags that were clearly visible, made a show of verifying what didn't need verification. The theater of suspicion played out in bright fluorescent light. She stood there, waiting. Her face gave nothing away. But inside is where the humiliation lives. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Not the moment itself, but the way it settles into your bones, becomes part of how you understand your place in the world. Other customers passed through checkout. Their transactions were quick, casual, unmarked by scrutiny. A woman with a full cart sailed through self-checkout without a second glance from staff. A man juggling shopping bags and a phone barely slowed as he paid and left. The contrast was a billboard nobody wanted to read. The guard finished his inspection, finding exactly what anyone with eyes could have told him he'd find. Products not yet purchased, held openly in a store basket, by a customer who'd committed no crime except the crime of shopping while black. "Everything looks fine," he said, handing back the basket. No apology, no acknowledgement that what had just happened was procedure applied with prejudice. Just that empty phrase, "Everything looks fine," as if his looking had been necessary, as if his suspicion had been reasonable, as if she should be grateful for his clearance to continue existing in a space her money was apparently good enough for, but her presence was not. "Thank you," Kamala said. The words came automatic, trained into people who learn young that politeness is armor, that courtesy can be the difference between a bad situation and a worse one. But something had shifted inside her. Something had hardened into clarity. She walked toward the checkout counter, basket still in hand, items ready to be scanned and purchased. The routine should have continued. Scan, pay, leave, forget. That's how most of these moments end. Swallowed, silenced, filed away in the vast archive of indignities too small to fight and too constant to ignore. But Kamala stopped walking. She stood there in the middle of the aisle, basket hanging from her arm, and something in her posture changed. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a subtle straightening, a quiet decision being made. The cashier looked up, ready to process her items. "Ready when you are, ma'am." Kamala looked at the products in her basket. Shampoo, lotion, ordinary things. Things she needed, things she'd selected, things she'd been treated like a criminal for touching. Then she looked past the cashier, toward the store manager who'd been watching from his position near customer service. Their eyes met. He looked away first. She turned back to the shelves, and she started adding items to her basket. Not quickly, not frantically. With the same calm, deliberate pace she'd maintained since walking in. She selected a second bottle of shampoo, then a third. Added conditioner, body wash, hand soap. Moved to the next aisle and picked up vitamins. Moved again and selected cleaning supplies. The basket filled. When it could hold no more, she took a cart. Employees watched this transformation, this quiet escalation, with growing confusion. The security guard shifted his weight, uncertain. The manager frowned. What was happening here didn't fit the script they'd written in their heads about who she was and what she was doing. Kamala moved through the store like a woman on a mission she hadn't known she had until the moment demanded it. Not stealing, the opposite of stealing, selecting, claiming, purchasing with intention that bordered on ceremony. She filled that cart like she was stocking a shelter, toiletries, paper products, groceries, over-the-counter medications. The total climbed into hundreds of dollars, then kept climbing. Other shoppers noticed now. Hard not to. A woman systematically working through aisles, building a mountain of products in her cart. Her face calm as riverstone. Her purpose legible only to those who knew how to read it. This wasn't about the products anymore. This was about something else entirely. When the cart could hold no more, she pushed it to the register. The young cashier looked at the overflowing cart, then at Kamala, then back at the cart. "Find everything okay?" The question was routine. The answer wasn't. "I did," Kamala said. "Ring it all up, please." The cashier started scanning. Beep after beep after beep. The register's total climbed. $300, $400, $500. The line behind Kamala grew, but no one complained. Everyone felt it now, that something was happening here beyond a simple shopping transaction. The manager appeared at the register, drawn by the spectacle of the total. "Is there a problem?" Kamala looked at him. Really looked at him. "No problem. Just paying for what I'm taking." The emphasis was subtle but unmistakable. Paying for what I'm taking. The words hung in the air between them, a quiet indictment. The total reached $800. "How will you be paying today?" the cashier asked. Kamala reached into her purse, that same purse the security guard had insisted on checking, and pulled out not a credit card, not a debit card, but cash. Clean bills, counted out deliberately, placed on the counter with the kind of care that transforms payment into statement. She counted aloud, each $100 bill landing with its own small thunder. The manager watched, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding, to something that might have been shame if he'd been willing to name it. The receipt printed, long as a scroll, documenting everything. The cashier handed it over with both hands, like presenting evidence. "Would you like help carrying this to your car?" "No," Kamala said. "I've got it." She loaded her bags, and there were many, into her cart. Every employee in the front of the store watched as she pushed that cart toward the exit, her posture unchanged, her pace unhurried. At the door, she stopped, turned back, looked at the security guard one more time, She didn't say anything, didn't need to. The bag said it all, the receipt said it all. It said, the $800 in cash said it all. She left the way she'd entered, through those smooth, silent glass doors, but she left different. Not diminished by what had happened, transformed by her response to it. Behind her, the store resumed its normal rhythm. Customers checked out, employees returned to their tasks. The incident would be forgotten by most within the hour, filed away as just another day, just another transaction. But some people would remember. Some wounds don't make noise going in. They just settle quiet and change the shape of things. And here, we keep record of what the silence tried to bury. Unseen wounds. Gostaria que eu continue com os próximos capítulos? The thing about humiliation is it doesn't just happen to one person. It spreads like spilled water, touching everyone in the room, forcing them to choose. Look away or look closer. Speak up or stay silent. Be part of the problem or part of the solution. In that store, there were witnesses. Always are. A young black mother with 2 children had been shopping 3 aisles over when the security guard first approached Kamala. She'd felt it before she saw it. That familiar tightening in her chest. That ancestral alarm system that goes off when one of your own is being marked. She'd looked up from comparing cereal prices and seen the scene unfolding. Her first instinct was to move closer, to position herself as witness, as protection, as solidarity. Her second instinct was to protect her children from seeing what she'd seen too many times already. The calculation was instant and exhausting. Shield them or teach them. Pretend the world is fair or show them the truth. She chose truth. Stayed where she was, but stayed watching. Her daughter, maybe 7 years old, tugged her sleeve. "Mama, why is that man bothering that lady?" Out of the mouths of children comes the clarity adults learn to complicate. Why is that man bothering that lady? Because the lady was doing nothing. Because the lady was black. Because some people are taught to see threat where there's only humanity. Because sometimes people make mistakes, baby, the mother said, though she knew it wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are accidental. This was structural. The daughter watched as Kamala handed over her basket for inspection. But she didn't do anything wrong. No, baby, she didn't. Then why? Because the world isn't always fair. And that's why we have to be better. Nearby, an elderly white woman with a cart full of groceries had also stopped to watch. She'd seen the guard approach, seen the unnecessary inspection, seen the presumption of guilt applied to innocence. Something in her face shifted. Discomfort, recognition, maybe even shame for a system she'd benefited from without questioning. She could have said something. Could have walked over and interrupted the guard's performance, used her privilege as shield for someone who needed it. But she didn't. She looked away, suddenly very interested in her shopping list, and kept moving. That's how it survives, you understand. Not through the people who actively harm, but through the many who witness harm and choose comfort over courage. A teenage boy stocking shelves had paused mid-task to watch. He was new. Barely 3 weeks on the job, still learning the rhythms of retail. This was his first time seeing the security protocol applied this way. Or at least, the first time he'd noticed. Maybe it had happened before, and he'd been too busy to see. Too trained to ignore what wasn't his business. But now he saw. He saw the guard check a basket that clearly held products not yet purchased. He saw the way other customers passed through unchecked. He saw the mathematics of who gets trusted and who gets scrutinized, and something in that equation didn't balance. He looked toward his manager, expecting some intervention, some correction. But the manager just nodded, approving the guard's actions, reinforcing the routine. The teenager felt something shift inside him. A small awakening. The beginning of understanding that the job he'd taken to earn money for college came with a moral cost he hadn't factored into the wage. He went back to stocking shelves, but slower now. His hands moved, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over questions about complicity, about silence, about who pays the price when everyone just follows policy. Another customer, a middle-aged Latino man, watched from the self-checkout area. He'd experienced his own version of this. The extra attention, the unspoken suspicion, the burden of proving belonging in spaces that should welcome everyone's money equally. He recognized the scene like you recognize a song you've heard in different languages but with the same melody. He wanted to say something, wanted to walk over and stand beside Kamala, make the guard uncomfortable with additional witnesses, force the situation into the light. But he had his own calculations to make. His own family waiting in the car, his own history of being told to stay in his lane, his own exhaustion from fighting battles that others refused to see as battles. So he watched, bore witness, carried the weight of knowing and not speaking, and that weight was its own burden. The cashiers at their registers kept scanning, kept smiling, kept asking, "Did you find everything okay?" to customers who hadn't been stopped, hadn't been questioned, hadn't had to prove their humanity as the price of purchasing shampoo. They noticed. Of course they noticed. You can't work retail and not notice when the machinery of suspicion clicks into gear. But noticing and acting are different countries separated by an ocean of job security, fear of confrontation, and the accumulated habit of minding your business. So the transaction continued. The inspection finished. The basket was returned. And all around that small interaction, life went on. People shopping, scanning, paying, leaving. The ordinary flow of commerce unmarked except for this one moment, this one woman, this one choice to see or to ignore. When Kamala began filling her cart with items, really filling it, the witnesses noticed that too. The young mother smiled, recognizing power reclaimed in the most unexpected way. The elderly white woman glanced back, confused. The teenage stalker paused again, watching with new interest. The Latino man nodded slowly, understanding the message being sent. They all saw the same thing happening, but they saw it through different lenses. Solidarity, discomfort, learning, recognition. The same moment refracted through 100 different experiences, 100 different histories. And when Kamala counted out those bills, when the receipt printed long as a judgment, when she walked out with her dignity intact and her point made, the witnesses carried that scene with them. Some would tell it later, some would bury it, some would learn from it, some would deny its meaning. But they all saw it. Everyone saw. Nobody spoke. And that silence has its own weight too. His name was Marcus, 28 years old, 2 years out of community college with a criminal justice degree he'd hoped would lead somewhere better than this. But here he was, wearing a uniform that gave him authority he hadn't earned and didn't quite know how to carry. He'd been trained, of course. 2 weeks of orientation covering theft prevention, customer interaction protocols, when to intervene and when to observe. They'd shown him statistics, shrinkage rates, high-risk behaviors, patterns to watch for. They'd taught him to trust his instincts, to stay alert, to protect the company's assets. What they hadn't taught him was how to separate instinct from assumption, or how centuries of poisoned thinking could dress itself up as professional vigilance. Marcus had watched Kamala enter the store through the security monitors, watched her move through the aisles with what he'd been trained to call suspicious behavior, touching multiple items, picking things up and putting them down, spending too long in one section. The training manual would call this loitering. Reality would call it shopping. But the training stuck harder than the reality. He'd seen her place items in the basket and felt that small spike of adrenaline that comes with potential confrontation. His supervisor had been standing nearby, had noticed Marcus noticing, had given him that small nod that meant, handle it. So he did. He approached with the script they'd given him, the professional courtesy that was supposed to make racial profiling feel like customer service. "Excuse me, ma'am. Just need to check your bag. Store policy." Store policy. The phrase he'd been told to use when the real reason couldn't be spoken out loud. He'd performed the inspection, finding nothing because there was nothing to find, and had felt that small deflation of being wrong mixed with the larger relief of conflict avoided. He'd handed back the basket thinking the situation was resolved, thinking he'd done his job correctly. Then Kamala had started shopping again. Really shopping. And Marcus had watched from his position near the entrance as her cart filled, as the total climbed. as the nature of her presence in the store transformed from suspected theft to substantial purchase. Something uncomfortable stirred in his chest. A question he didn't want to ask himself. Had he been wrong? Not wrong about her having items in her basket. That was observable fact. Wrong about what that fact meant. Wrong about who deserved suspicion and who deserved service. He watched her approach the checkout with that overflowing cart, watched the cashier's face register surprise, watched his manager hover near the transaction with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. And then came the cash. Bill after bill laid on the counter with deliberate precision, each one a small indictment. Marcus felt heat rise in his face, embarrassment mixed with something sharper, the beginning of understanding that he'd been a tool in someone else's humiliation, that his training had armed him with procedure but not wisdom, compliance but not conscience. The other employees were looking at him now, not directly, but he felt their glances. The teenage stalker, the cashiers, the manager, all of them witnesses to his error, accomplices to his assumption. He wanted to approach Kamala, to apologize, to explain that he was just doing his job, following protocols, acting on training. But those excuses tasted like ash even before he could speak them. Following orders, following protocols, following training. History was full of people who'd caused harm while following instructions from authorities who were themselves following structures built on bones and blood. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Pick up milk on your way home." Marcus looked at the message, then looked back at Kamala loading bags into her cart. He thought about his mother, a black woman who'd worked retail for 30 years, who'd told him stories he'd half listened to about being followed in stores, being watched, being presumed guilty of everything except humanity. He'd thought those stories were from a different time, thought the world had changed, thought his generation had moved past all that. Standing in this store, watching this woman leave with her dignity purchased at $800, Marcus realized how little had changed and how much he'd failed to see. His supervisor appeared at his elbow. "Good catch earlier. Can't be too careful." Marcus looked at the man, looked at his comfortable certainty, his complete lack of doubt, looked at the system that created guards like Marcus and trained them to see threats in shopping, danger in existing, criminality in blackness. "Yeah," Marcus said, but the word came out hollow. He thought about quitting, just walking out, shedding the uniform, washing his hands of the whole thing. But he needed this job, needed the paycheck that kept his apartment and his mother's phone bill paid, needed the health insurance, needed the resume line for better opportunities. So he was trapped too in his own way. Not the same way as Kamala. His trap came with wages and relative safety, and the option to leave if things got bad enough. But a trap nonetheless, where doing his job meant participating in a system that reduced people to risk assessments and skin tones to threat levels. That night, Marcus would go home and think about what happened, would turn it over in his mind like a stone, examining its edges, feeling its weight, would wonder if there was a way to do this job without doing harm, or if the job itself was the harm, would wonder if he was brave enough to quit, or smart enough to change things from inside, or just tired enough to keep showing up and following orders until the questions stopped bothering him. He'd seen his father make that last choice, watched a man who'd once believed in justice gradually accept injustice as the price of survival, watched hope calcify into cynicism, watched fire cool into ash. Marcus didn't want to become that, but he didn't know how to avoid it either. The store returned to normal. Customers came and went. The registers beeped their mechanical rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago. But Marcus felt different. Felt marked somehow. Initiated into a truth he couldn't unknown. He'd been the guard. He'd been the one who approached, who demanded, who inspected. He'd been the face of a system that was old before he was born, and would outlive him if people like him kept playing their part without question. The choice ahead was simple and impossible. Keep being the guard, or find another way to be a man. Tonight, he'd clock out and go home. Tomorrow, he'd clock in and put the uniform back on. The day after that, and the day after that. But something had cracked. Some certainty had fractured, and in that fracture, questions grew. Some jobs ask for your time, others ask for your soul, and sometimes you don't know the price until you've already paid. Kamala sat in her car in the parking lot, hands still on the steering wheel though the engine wasn't running. Shopping bags filled the back seat and trunk. $800 worth of products she didn't particularly need, purchased as protest, as statement, as the only form of power available in that moment. The receipt lay on the passenger seat, long and white and specific, documenting every item, every price, every tax calculation, evidence, proof. The paper trail of dignity reclaimed at commercial rates. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but inside something trembled. This wasn't the first time. That's what people never understand when they hear these stories. They think it's an isolated incident, a bad apple, an unfortunate misunderstanding. They don't see the pattern, the accumulation, the death by 1,000 cuts that is the daily experience of moving through America in black skin. Last month, it had been a different store. A clerk following her through the cosmetics section, pretending to organize shelves that were already organized, staying 3 steps behind like a shadow she couldn't shake. She'd left without buying anything that day, unwilling to give her money to a place that treated her presence like a problem. Before that, a restaurant where the host had looked at her reservation, looked at her face, and suddenly the table wasn't ready despite being visibly empty. She'd waited 40 minutes while white couples who arrived after her were seated immediately. When she'd finally been shown to her table, it was near the kitchen, near the bathrooms, in the space reserved for people the establishment tolerated, but didn't want seen. Before that, a job interview where every question had an unspoken subtext. How do you handle stress? Meaning, will you get angry? How do you work in team environments? Meaning, will you make the white people uncomfortable? She hadn't gotten the job. They'd gone with someone who was a better cultural fit. The stories stacked up like sediment, layer upon layer, year upon year. Each one small enough to be dismissed individually, but together forming a mountain of evidence that she was expected to carry alone and in silence. Kamala looked at the store through her windshield. From here it looked normal, innocent, just a building where people bought things they needed. You couldn't see the suspicion from this distance. Couldn't see the way eyes tracked certain customers and ignored others. Couldn't see the invisible architecture of bias that determined who belonged and who was merely tolerated. She thought about the $800, money she hadn't planned to spend, money that could have gone to savings, to bills, to 100 more practical purposes. Money spent instead on making a point that would likely be forgotten by everyone except her. Was it worth it? The question sat heavy in her chest. Part of her felt powerful, felt like she'd refused to be diminished, had turned humiliation into demonstration, had used the only language capitalism understood, currency, to speak a truth that words couldn't carry. But another part felt exhausted, tired of having to fight, tired of every shopping trip being a potential battlefield, tired of calculating the cost of dignity in dollars and cents and emotional labor. She thought about the young mother she'd glimpsed watching the confrontation, the little girl asking questions her mother would have to answer with careful honesty. Thought about the teenage worker who'd paused to witness, maybe seeing his job differently now. Thought about all the other black women and men who'd walked into that store and been subjected to the same scrutiny, but who hadn't had $800 cash to make their point. That thought settled like a stone. The power she'd claimed wasn't available to everyone. The luxury of response she'd exercised required resources that not everyone had. She'd been able to make her statement because she had the money to make it. But what about the single mother working 2 jobs? The college student on a tight budget? The elderly man on a fixed income? They faced the same humiliation without the same options for resistance. The dignity she'd purchased had come at a price others couldn't pay. Kamala pulled out her phone. For a moment, she considered posting about what happened, putting the store on blast, using social media to amplify the incident, force accountability, maybe prevent the next person from experiencing the same treatment. But she knew how that would go. The comments would divide predictably. Some would support her. Others would question every detail. What had she been wearing? How had she been acting? Was she sure it was racial profiling and not just standard procedure? The store would issue a non-apology about being committed to serving all customers. The guard would probably be fired, scapegoated, while the system that trained him continued unchanged. And she'd become the story instead of the incident being the story. Her name, her face, her life picked apart by strangers who'd never experienced what she'd experienced, but felt entitled to judge her response to it. She put the phone away. Some battles you fight publicly, others you carry privately, adding them to the collection of indignities you've learned to metabolize into survival. The sun was setting now, painting the parking lot in shades of orange and gold. Beautiful, in the way that moments can be beautiful even when your heart is heavy. Kamala started the engine. She had places to be, people expecting her, responsibilities that didn't stop just because she'd had to spend $800 proving her humanity to strangers. She'd go home. She'd unload the shopping bags. She'd put away products she didn't need and probably wouldn't use. And tomorrow, she'd wake up and do it all again. Navigate the world as a black woman in America, calculating every interaction, measuring every risk, carrying the weight of other people's assumptions about who she was, based on nothing but the color of her skin. This was the price of dignity in a country that made you purchase what should have been given freely. Not $800. That was just money. The real price was the exhaustion, the vigilance, the constant awareness that you might have to defend your right to exist in spaces that welcomed your money, but not your humanity. Kamala pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the store behind but carrying the experience with her, adding it to the archive of memories she'd have to process later, in private, in the quiet moments when the armor came off and she could afford to feel the full weight of what it cost to be herself, in a world that saw her as suspect first and human second. The receipt stayed on the passenger seat, fluttering slightly from the AC vent, evidence of a transaction that was about so much more than shampoo and lotion. Proof that she'd been there, that it had happened, that she'd refused to disappear quietly. Tomorrow, she'd file it away with all the others. Tonight, she'd just drive home. Some victories feel like losses. Some resistance costs more than surrender. But some things you can't put a price on. David had been a store manager for 12 years. 12 years of inventory reports, employee schedules, customer complaints, and corporate directives. 12 years of climbing a ladder that led to assistant regional manager if he played his cards right, kept his numbers up, and didn't make waves. He'd watched the entire incident unfold from his position near customer service. Watched Marcus approach Kamala, watched the inspection, watched what came after. And he'd done nothing. Not because he didn't see what was happening. He saw it clear as the fluorescent lights overhead, saw the presumption, the profiling, the application of store policy in a way that was anything but policy. Policy would mean checking everyone or checking no one. This was something else wearing policy's clothes. But David had his own calculations to make. Corporate had been pushing hard on shrinkage reduction. Every regional meeting, the same message. Theft was cutting into profits, and managers needed to be more vigilant. They showed charts, graphs, percentages. They praised stores that had reduced losses and questioned stores that hadn't. They never said the quiet part out loud, never explicitly told managers to watch black customers more closely. They didn't have to. The training materials did that work for them. Statistics about high-risk demographics, videos showing theft scenarios that somehow always featured the same type of people, policies that gave employees discretion to act on reasonable suspicion without defining what made suspicion reasonable. David had sat through those trainings, had nodded along, had implemented the directives because that's what good managers did. They followed corporate guidance, they hit their numbers, they moved up. He'd never thought of himself as racist. Racism was burning crosses and slurs. Racism was overt, obvious, the kind of thing you could point to and condemn. This was just business, just procedure, just doing his job in a competitive retail environment where margins were thin and every percentage point mattered. But watching Kamala count out those bills, watching that receipt print with its damning length, something in David's comfortable narrative cracked. He thought about his own shopping experiences, how he walked into stores without being followed, how he could browse for an hour without anyone questioning his presence, how he could fill a basket, change his mind about items, put things back, pick them up again, and nobody saw that as suspicious behavior worth monitoring. He thought about the privilege of being unremarkable, of being granted the presumption of innocence before any evidence suggested guilt, of moving through commercial spaces as a customer first and a potential threat never. That privilege had been invisible to him until this moment, watching someone be denied what he'd always taken for granted. The store was quiet now. The evening shift had started. New employees came in for the closing routine, unaware of what had happened hours earlier. Life moved on. The registers kept beeping. Customers kept shopping. The machinery of commerce continued its relentless churn. David went to his office and closed the door, sat at his desk surrounded by binders full of policies and procedures, manuals that told him how to handle every situation except how to handle his own conscience. He pulled up the security footage, rewound to when Kamala first entered, watched her move through the aisles in black and white silence, watched Marcus watching her, watched himself watching Marcus. Frame by frame, he saw the moment where he could have intervened, where he could have pulled Marcus aside, reminded him that a customer browsing wasn't suspicious behavior, redirected his attention elsewhere, could have prevented the whole thing. He'd had the power. He'd had the position. He'd had the authority. He'd chosen not to use any of it. David thought about calling corporate, reporting the incident, recommending additional sensitivity training, making some gesture toward acknowledgement and change. But he knew how that conversation would go. Corporate would thank him for his vigilance in bringing the matter to their attention. They'd send some generic training module that employees would click through without reading. They'd update a policy document that nobody would implement. And then they'd note in his file that his store had generated a complaint, that there'd been an incident, that his management had created liability. His promotion chances would suffer. His bonus would shrink. His career trajectory would flatten. The math was simple and cruel. Doing the right thing carried professional costs he wasn't willing to pay. David closed the security footage, deleted the saved clip. There was no formal complaint, no lawsuit pending, no reason to maintain evidence of what had happened. Better to let it disappear into the vast archive of unmemorable retail transactions. He thought about Marcus. The young guard was probably beating himself up over the interaction, wrestling with doubts and questions. David could talk to him, could explain the complexities of security work, could reinforce that he'd followed training correctly, even if the result had been uncomfortable. Or David could say nothing. Let Marcus work it out on his own. Let the system keep functioning as it always had, grinding forward on the momentum of a million small choices to prioritize comfort over justice. David picked up his phone, thought about calling his wife, telling her about his day, seeking some perspective or absolution. But what would he say? That he'd watched a black woman be humiliated in his store and he'd done nothing to stop it? That his silence had been a choice and he'd chosen career over conscience? That 12 years of climbing had brought him to a position where he had power but lacked courage to use it? He put the phone down. Tomorrow he'd review inventory reports. He'd conduct employee evaluations. He'd analyze sales data and adjust staffing schedules. He'd do all the tasks that made him good at his job and bad at being human. And maybe if he stayed busy enough, he could stop thinking about the look in Kamala's eyes when she'd met his across the store. That moment of recognition. That silent question. Are you going to do something? And his silent answer. No. The office felt smaller suddenly. The walls closer, the air thinner. David had built his career on following rules, hitting targets, advancing steadily through a corporate structure that rewarded compliance and punished disruption. He thought that was enough. Thought being professional meant doing his job well. He hadn't realized that sometimes doing your job well meant participating in harm. That neutrality in the face of injustice was just injustice with better job security. He turned off his computer, straightened his desk, locked his office. Tomorrow would be another day. Another shift. Another opportunity to choose. But tonight, driving home past strip malls and traffic lights, David carried the weight of knowing he'd had power and hadn't used it, had seen wrong and hadn't corrected it, had been exactly the kind of person who made systems like this possible. Some choices we make once, others we make every day we show up and say nothing. 7-year-old Maya couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen in the store. That night at dinner, she pushed peas around her plate, her mind replaying the scene. The security guard approaching the lady, the inspection of the basket, the way everyone had watched but nobody had helped. "Mama," she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence of the meal. "Why did that man check that lady's bag?" Her mother, Angela, set down her fork. She'd known this conversation was coming, had been preparing for it since they'd left the store hours ago. But knowing it was coming didn't make it easier. "Because sometimes people make assumptions about other people," Angela said carefully. "They judge based on how someone looks instead of how they act." Maya's forehead wrinkled the way it did when she was working through a problem. But she wasn't doing anything wrong, she was just shopping. "You're right, baby." "Then why did he think she was stealing?" Angela looked at her daughter. 7 years old and already encountering the mathematics of American racism. Too young to understand the full equation, but old enough to see that the numbers didn't add up. How do you explain to a child that the world will see her differently than it sees her white classmates? That her innocence has an expiration date her peers will never face? That she'll need to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy? How do you prepare her without stealing her childhood? How do you protect her without lying about the danger? "Remember how we talked about skin color?" Angela began. "How people come in different shades and that's beautiful?" Maya nodded. "Well, some people, not everyone, but some, they've been taught to be afraid of people who look like us, people with brown skin, and that fear makes them see danger where there isn't any." "That's stupid," Maya said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "It is stupid, but it's also real, and you need to understand that so you can protect yourself." Maya was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "Is that why you always tell me to keep my hands visible in stores? And not to touch things unless I'm going to buy them?" Angela felt something crack in her chest. Her daughter was 7 years old and already learning the rules of survival, already understanding that her behavior would be interpreted differently than the behavior of her white friends. "Yes, baby, that's why. That's not fair." "No, it's not. Why don't people change it?" The question every black parent dreads and cannot answer adequately. Why don't people change it? Because change requires the people with power to give up comfort. Because injustice benefits those who benefit from it. Because systems perpetuate themselves through a million small choices to look away, stay quiet, keep things as they are. But you can't say all that to a 7-year-old. "Some people are trying to change it," Angela said instead. "People who speak up when they see unfairness. People who treat everyone with respect regardless of how they look. People like that lady in the store. Did you see what she did after the guard checked her bag?" Maya nodded eagerly. "She bought everything. Like everything, the whole store almost. That's right, she didn't yell or cry or leave. She showed them that she belonged there just as much as anyone else, that she had every right to shop without being treated like a criminal. Sometimes that's how you fight back, by refusing to be small, by taking up the space you deserve." Maya thought about this. "I want to be like her when I grow up." You can be, baby. You can be strong and proud and demand respect. But you also need to be smart. You need to understand that the world won't always be fair, and you need to know how to navigate that. What does navigate mean? It means finding your way through something difficult. Like how we practice what to do if a police officer stops us, remember? Maya's face grew serious. They'd had that conversation too. The talk that black parents give their children earlier than they should have to. Keep your hands visible. Don't reach for anything. Answer politely. Don't argue. Survive the encounter and fight the injustice later. The survival calculus that white children never learn because they never need to. I remember, Maya said quietly. Angela reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. I know this is hard to understand. I know it's not fair that you have to think about these things when your friends don't. But I need you to know these things to keep you safe. Why can't we just be safe already? Why do we have to work for it? Out of the mouths of babes. Why indeed? Because the world hasn't caught up to where it should be yet, Angela said. Because change is slow and people are stubborn, and sometimes fear is stronger than sense. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. That doesn't mean we accept it. Did you ever have someone check your bag like that? Angela thought about the countless times, the department store in college where security had followed her through 3 floors, the grocery store where a clerk had demanded to see her receipt when she'd set off the alarm, even though the white woman ahead of her, who'd also set it off, had walked through unchecked, the pharmacy where they'd accused her of trying to use a fake prescription for her own medication. Yes, she said simply. Many times. What did you do? Sometimes I spoke up. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I had the energy to fight, and sometimes I was just too tired. There's no right answer, baby. You do what you need to do to survive the moment and keep your dignity intact. Maya squeezed her mother's hand. I'm sorry that happened to you, Mama. And there it was. 7 years old and already carrying empathy for her mother's pain. Already understanding on some level that this would be her inheritance too. The burden passed down through generations of black mothers to black daughters. How to be excellent in a world that presumes you're inadequate. How to be dignified in spaces designed to diminish you. How to keep your humanity in systems built to strip it away. I'm sorry you had to see what happened today, Angela said. But I'm also glad you noticed it. Glad you asked questions. Because noticing is the first step toward changing things. As long as people keep noticing, keep questioning, keep refusing to accept unfairness as normal, there's hope. I'll always notice, Maya promised. Angela smiled, sad and proud in equal measure. I know you will, baby. I know you will. They finished dinner quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. Maya thinking about the lady in the store and the guard and the unfairness of a world that judged people by their skin. Angela thinking about how many more of these conversations they'd have to have. How many more lessons her daughter would learn the hard way. Later, tucking Maya into bed, Angela kissed her forehead and whispered, You are brilliant and beautiful and worthy of respect. Don't ever let anyone make you believe otherwise. I won't, Mama. But Angela knew better. Knew that the world would try over and over to convince her daughter of her inadequacy. Would try through 1,000 small cuts to make her doubt her worth, question her belonging, accept less than she deserved. The fight would be long, the lessons would be hard. But tonight her daughter was still 7. Still young enough to believe that fairness would win. Still innocent enough to think that noticing problems was the same as solving them. Angela turned off the light and closed the door softly. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, but tonight, she let her daughter sleep in hope. Some lessons we teach, others the world teaches for us, and we just hold our children close and prepare them for both. The corporate office sat 17 floors above the city, glass and steel reflecting clouds and ambition. Inside, the VP of Loss Prevention reviewed the monthly reports from regional managers, scanning spreadsheets that reduced human behavior to data points, translated retail interactions into profit margins. Her name was Jennifer, 20 years with the company, starting as a cashier, and climbing through determination and strategic networking to this position where she influenced policy for 700 stores across 12 states. She'd built her career on numbers, shrinkage reduction percentages, theft recovery rates, cost-benefit analyses of security measures, clean, quantifiable metrics that corporate boards understood and rewarded. The human element didn't appear in her reports. The fear in a teenager's eyes when security approaches. The humiliation of a mother accused in front of her children. The exhaustion of communities over-policed in commercial spaces the same way they're over-policed in public ones. Those things didn't have columns in the spreadsheet. Jennifer's assistant knocked and entered. The regional call is ready. She joined the video conference, faces appearing in neat squares on her screen. Regional managers from across the country, gathering for their quarterly review. Good performers and struggling ones, stores beating targets, and stores needing intervention. "Let's start with the Southeast region," Jennifer began. "I'm seeing excellent numbers on theft prevention. David, your store in particular has shown strong performance. What's your secret?" David's face appeared larger on screen. The manager who'd watched Kamala be humiliated and done nothing now presented his success story to the executives who'd created the conditions that made such humiliation routine. "We've been very diligent about following the training protocols," David said. "Increased vigilance on high-risk behaviors, better communication between staff and security, consistent application of our verification procedures." Translation: they'd been watching black customers more closely, stopping them more frequently, creating an environment where suspicion masqueraded as customer service. Jennifer made a note. "Excellent work. We'll want to share those best practices with other regions." She moved through the agenda: store performance, inventory accuracy, loss prevention metrics. Every discussion circled back to the same goal: reduce shrinkage, increase profits, improve efficiency. Nobody mentioned discrimination. Nobody discussed racial profiling. Nobody questioned whether their policies disproportionately targeted certain communities. They didn't need to discuss it. It was built into the foundation, the training materials, the security protocols, the discretion given to staff to act on reasonable suspicion without defining reasonable. The statistics they cited about theft patterns without examining the bias in who got watched, who got stopped, who got arrested, versus who got warnings. The system perpetuated itself through silence and spreadsheets. After the call, Jennifer returned to her office. Her walls were decorated with awards: retail excellence, loss prevention innovation, corporate leadership. Plaques and certificates testifying to her success in a system she'd never questioned, because questioning it would mean acknowledging her complicity. Her phone buzzed. A text from her college roommate. A black woman who'd taken a different path, became a civil rights attorney, fought battles Jennifer observed from a comfortable distance. The text included a news article about racial profiling in retail, statistics about black shoppers being followed, stopped, and accused at rates dramatically higher than white shoppers. Expert commentary about the psychological impact. Calls for policy reform. Jennifer skimmed the article and set her phone down. She thought about her own policies, the training she'd developed and implemented across 700 stores, the metrics she tracked, the bonuses she received for reducing theft numbers that may have been reduced through discrimination. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her boss entered without waiting for invitation. "Saw the regional numbers," he said. "Strong quarter. The board is pleased." "Thank you. Keep doing what you're doing. Whatever methods you're using, they're working. Whatever methods." The phrase hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Don't ask. Don't tell. Results matter, not how you get them. Plausible deniability for executives who benefit from discrimination without wanting to name it. He left. Jennifer turned back to her computer, to the spreadsheets and reports that made inequality look like efficiency. She thought about resigning, walking away from a career built on policies that harmed people who looked like her college roommate. Starting over somewhere else, doing something that didn't require moral compromise. But the salary, the benefits, the retirement account that grew with every quarter of strong performance, the position and prestige and power she'd worked 20 years to achieve. The cost of conscience was too high. So Jennifer did what she'd always done. She compartmentalized, put the uncomfortable thoughts in a box, closed the lid, returned to work. Analyzed data, refined policies, sent directives to managers who'd implement them in stores where people like Kamala would continue to be stopped, questioned, humiliated. The system required this. Required people in positions like Jennifer's to prioritize profit over people, to hide harm behind procedure, to build careers on the backs of communities already carrying too much weight. And the system rewarded this, with promotions and bonuses and corner offices 17 floors above the reality on the ground. Jennifer opened a new email to regional managers. Subject line, Q3 loss prevention targets. She typed out expectations, increased vigilance, consistent protocol application, better training on identifying suspicious behavior. The same language she'd used for years, the same policies that had always produced results, the same harm dressed up as best practices. She hit send. 700 stores received her directive. Thousands of employees read her words. Millions of customers would experience the impact of policies she'd crafted in an office that smelled like expensive coffee and recycled air. And Jennifer would get promoted for it, would climb another rung, would give another presentation about excellence in loss prevention, would never have to look into the eyes of the people her policies hurt. That evening, driving home in her leased luxury sedan, Jennifer passed a strip mall, saw a black woman entering a store with her children, wondered for just a moment if that woman would be followed, watched, stopped, wondered if policies Jennifer had written would be applied to that woman today. The thought lasted 3 seconds. Then the light changed and Jennifer drove on, heading toward a home in a neighborhood where she never had to worry about being watched in stores, never had to teach her children survival strategies for shopping, never had to calculate the cost of dignity in everyday transactions. She turned on the radio, listened to news about the economy, the stock market, corporate earnings. Listened to a world that sounded clean when you removed the human voices. Her company's stock was up. Shareholders were happy. The board was pleased. Everything was working exactly as designed. And that was the problem Jennifer would never let herself see. Some people build the machine. Some people oil the gears. And some people just count the profits while others pay the cost. Monica had worked the register for 3 years. 3 years of scanning barcodes, making change, asking, "Did you find everything okay?" to customers who rarely looked her in the eye. 3 years of standing on feet that ached by hour 2, smiling through rudeness, absorbing the small violences of retail work. She'd been the one to ring up Kamala's $800 purchase, had watched the total climb with growing awareness that something significant was happening, even if she couldn't name exactly what. Now, days later, Monica couldn't stop thinking about it. She'd seen the guard approach Kamala, had watched from her register, pretending to organize receipt tape while the inspection happened, had felt that familiar tightening in her stomach, the one that came whenever she witnessed something wrong but felt powerless to stop it. Monica was black too. 23 years old, working retail to pay for community college classes she took at night, dreaming of becoming a nurse, of working somewhere that helped people instead of surveilling them. She knew what Kamala had felt, knew it in her bones, in her memory, in the accumulated experience of moving through America in skin that made some people nervous. Monica had been followed in stores since she was 12, had been stopped, questioned, accused, had learned to keep receipts for everything, to make her purchases visible, to perform innocence constantly because the presumption of guilt was automatic. Working on the other side of the transaction hadn't changed her understanding. If anything, it had deepened it. She saw how the system worked from the inside now, saw which customers got watched and which ones didn't, saw how managers communicated suspicion through glances and codes, saw how security knew without being told explicitly who to follow. The training had been clear. Treat all customers equally. The reality was different. Monica thought about speaking up during Kamala's inspection, thought about calling out to the guard, "Hey, she's just shopping, leave her alone." Thought about using her position as an employee to interrupt the humiliation, but she'd stayed quiet, kept scanning items for other customers, kept her head down and her mouth shut, because she needed this job. Needed the paycheck that covered tuition and rent and helped her mother with bills. Needed the health insurance. Needed the reference for future employment. And she knew what happened to employees who made waves, who questioned management, who challenged procedures. They got fewer hours, got assigned to worse shifts, got written up for minor infractions everyone committed but only some got punished for. They got managed out. So Monica had stayed quiet, had watched injustice happen and done nothing, had been complicit through silence. And now it sat heavy on her conscience. When Kamala had approached her register with that overflowing cart, Monica had understood immediately what was happening. Understood the message being sent. Understood that this was resistance in the only language capitalism couldn't ignore. Currency. She'd scanned each item with care, had watched the total climb, had seen the cash come out and recognized it for what it was. Dignity purchased at retail price. "Have a good day," Monica had said when it was done, and she'd meant it. Meant it as acknowledgement, as solidarity, as silent apology for not doing more. Kamala had looked at her, really looked, and nodded. A moment of recognition between two black women navigating the same hostile territory from different positions. That look stayed with Monica. She thought about quitting. Thought about walking out, finding work somewhere else, refusing to participate in a system that made her watch people who looked like her be humiliated. But where would she go? Retail was retail. Same policies, different store. Same surveillance, different uniform. The problem wasn't this particular job. It was the whole structure of how America treated black people in commercial spaces. Quitting wouldn't solve anything. It would just make her unemployed and righteous, which wouldn't pay her tuition or her mother's light bill. Monica was trapped in the same way Marcus was trapped, the same way David was trapped, not by chains, but by economics and exhaustion, and the grinding reality that resistance costs more than compliance. But unlike Marcus and David, Monica didn't have the luxury of pretending she didn't understand. She lived the experience they only witnessed, carried in her body the knowledge of what it felt like to be watched, followed, stopped, questioned. She couldn't not see it, couldn't compartmentalize it the way people with more distance could. Every shift, she saw it happen. Saw security trail black customers. Saw managers exchange meaningful glances when brown faces entered. Saw the careful choreography of discrimination disguised as diligence. And every shift, she stayed quiet, scanned items, made change, smiled at customers and said, "Have a good day," like everything was normal. Like she wasn't dying a little inside every time she participated in her own people's humiliation. That night, Monica sat in her car after her shift ended, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness, soul tired, weary from the constant weight of witnessing harm and being unable or unwilling to stop it. She thought about nursing school, about the dream of doing work that helped instead of harmed, about wearing scrubs instead of a retail uniform, about treating patients with dignity regardless of who they were. But nursing school required money, required this job, required her to keep showing up, keep scanning, keep staying quiet about the injustices she witnessed. The cost of her dreams was paid in compromised conscience. Monica started her car, drove home through streets where she'd lived her whole life, past stores where she'd been followed, neighborhoods where she'd been profiled, spaces where her presence was tolerated but not welcomed. Tomorrow, she'd clock in again, would stand at her register, would watch it happen again to someone else, would stay quiet again, would hate herself a little more for it. This was the trap. Not poverty exactly, though that was part of it, but the trap of needing to survive in a system designed to exploit that need. The trap of having to participate in your own oppression because the alternative was unemployment, and all the cascading disasters that followed. Monica understood what Kamala had done with that $800 purchase. Understood it as an act of resistance available only to those with resources. But Monica didn't have $800 to make statements with. She had tuition payments and rent and a mother depending on her. So she'd keep showing up, keep scanning, keep witnessing, keep carrying the weight of seeing clearly but acting carefully, of knowing better but doing what was necessary to survive. Some cages don't have bars, some chains don't make noise, and some people pay for their freedom with pieces of their soul. 3 weeks after Kamala's $800 statement, the store looked exactly the same. Same fluorescent lights, same orderly aisles, same register beeps and shopping cart wheels squeaking across polished floors. Nothing had changed. Marcus still worked security, still watched monitors, still approached customers when managers signaled concern. The incident with Kamala had troubled him for exactly 5 days before the routine swallowed his doubts. Bills needed paying, shifts needed working, questions needed quieting. David still managed, still reviewed reports, still praised employees for vigilance and questioned those who showed insufficient attention to high-risk behaviors. The discomfort he'd felt watching Kamala had faded like morning fog, burned off by the relentless sun of corporate expectations and career advancement. Jennifer still sent directives from 17 floors up, still refined policies, still tracked metrics that measured theft prevention without measuring human cost. The article her friend had sent remained unread in her messages, buried under newer notifications about quarterly earnings and shareholder meetings. Monica still scanned items, still watched injustice happen, still carried the weight of witnessing and staying silent. Her nursing school applications sat half-finished on her laptop, delayed by exhaustion and the grinding reality of working full-time while taking classes. The system hadn't noticed Kamala's protest, or rather, it had noticed the way systems notice disruptions, by absorbing them, processing them, continuing unchanged. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, a young black man named James entered the store. 20 years old, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, earbuds in, moving with the casual purpose of someone who knows what he needs and where to find it. He headed straight for the electronics section, looking for phone chargers, comparing prices, doing the mental math of quality versus cost that young people with tight budgets perform constantly. Marcus noticed him on the monitors, noticed the way he picked up items, examined them, put them back, noticed the hoodie, the age, the race, noticed in a way he'd been trained to notice, in a way that transformed ordinary shopping into suspicious behavior. The pattern activated, ancient machinery grinding forward on greased tracks of prejudice and procedure. Marcus left his post, made his way to the electronics section, positioned himself within sight but not too close, maintaining the pretense of casual presence while executing surveillance. James felt the attention. Every black person develops that sixth sense, that awareness of being watched. He looked up, saw the security guard, understood immediately what was happening. His shoulders tightened. His movements became more deliberate, more visible, more performed. The automatic response of someone who'd been through this before, who knew the script, who understood that his ordinary behavior would be read as suspicious no matter how innocent. He picked up a phone charger, looked at the price, put it in his basket. The store basket, visible and official, not concealed in pockets or bags. Marcus watched, maintained his distance but maintained his presence. The unspoken message clear: you're being monitored. Other customers browsed nearby. White teenagers clustered around video games, loud and animated, touching multiple products, opening packages to look inside, actual behavior that could raise loss prevention concerns. Nobody watched them. A white woman in her 30s filled her cart with electronics, expensive headphones, charging cables, portable speakers. Hundreds of dollars of merchandise accumulated without drawing attention. Nobody followed her. But James, with his single $20 phone charger in a visible basket, carried the weight of security scrutiny. He moved to the next aisle. Marcus followed, maintained his distance, maintained his watch. James stopped walking, turned to face the guard directly. "Can I help you with something?" His voice even, controlled but carrying an edge of exhaustion underneath. Marcus deployed the script. "Just making sure you're finding everything okay." "I'm fine, thanks." "Let me know if you need assistance." "I will." But Marcus didn't leave. Stayed in his orbit, a gravitational pull of suspicion that James couldn't escape simply by being innocent. James stood there, phone charger in basket, facing a choice. He could leave without purchasing, prove the suspicion right by walking away. He could confront the guard, prove the suspicion right by being aggressive. He could continue shopping under surveillance, prove nothing except that he was willing to tolerate intolerable treatment. There were no good options, just variations of indignity. He walked to the register. Monica was working, same as she'd been 3 weeks ago, same as she'd be tomorrow. She saw James approach, saw the tightness in his posture, saw Marcus hovering nearby, understood the entire situation without needing explanation. "Just this today?" she asked, scanning the charger. "Yeah." 23:47. James pulled out his wallet, paid with a card, waited for the receipt with Marcus still watching from 10 feet away, still telegraphing suspicion, still performing his role in the machinery. Monica handed over the receipt and the bag, made eye contact, a moment of recognition, of solidarity, of shared exhaustion with a system that ground them both down in different ways. "Have a good day," she said, meaning, "I see you. I'm sorry, I can't help." "You too," James said, meaning, "I know, it's not your fault. We're all just trying to survive this." He left, walked through the exit, passed through the sensors without incident because he'd purchased the item he'd been suspected of stealing before he'd even selected it. Marcus returned to his monitors, watched James leave the parking lot, made a mental note. Another successful prevention, another suspicious customer monitored, another day of doing his job correctly. The system recorded nothing, no complaint filed, no incident documented, no evidence that anything had happened beyond a routine customer interaction. But James carried it with him. Another interaction added to his collection. Another reminder that his presence in commercial spaces was conditional, suspicious, something to be managed rather than welcomed. He drove home thinking about how tired he was, how exhausting it was to be young and black and watched, how much energy it took to perform innocence constantly, to move carefully, to speak correctly, to be twice as good for half the presumption of innocence. The phone charger sat in the passenger seat, $23.47, plus the cost of dignity, plus the weight of suspicion, plus the exhaustion of being treated like a threat for the crime of existing. The store closed at 9, lights went out, doors locked. Employees went home to lives outside the building. Tomorrow it would open again. The same choreography would play out with different actors. Different black customers would be watched. Different guards would follow. Different managers would approve. Different cashiers would witness and stay silent. The pattern would repeat, would continue repeating, would keep grinding forward on the momentum of a million small choices to see some people as customers and others as suspects. This was the truth Kamala's $800 statement couldn't change. Individual resistance, no matter how powerful, couldn't stop a machine this big, this old, this deeply embedded in the foundation of how America does business. The machine ran on autopilot, on training and policy and metrics, on the complicity of good people who stayed quiet, on the exhaustion of victims too tired to fight every battle, on the profit motive that made discrimination financially rewarding. It ran and ran and ran. Some things don't change because one person fights back. Some patterns repeat because everyone else stays quiet. And the weight of that silence crushes us all, slowly, constantly. There's a conversation that happens in black homes across America. Happens over kitchen tables and in living rooms. Happens between parents and children, between friends, between strangers who recognize each other's exhaustion. It's the conversation about incidents, not one incident. Incidents, plural, accumulated. The ongoing collection of moments when you were reminded that your humanity is conditional, your presence suspicious, your dignity negotiable. Angela had that conversation with her daughter Maya after the store incident. Monica had it with her mother after watching Kamala's statement purchase. James had it with his roommate after being followed for a phone charger. And across the country, in homes where people with brown skin gather to process the daily indignities of American life, the same conversation repeats with different details, but the same essential truth. This is what it costs to exist here. The conversation starts with the incident, the specific moment, the particular store, the individual guard or manager or policy. But it never stays there. It can't, because no incident exists in isolation. Each one is part of a pattern so vast and so persistent that talking about one means talking about all of them. Maya asked why the guard checked the lady's bag, and Angela answered. But the answer required context, required explaining history and bias and structural racism, required teaching her daughter about a world that would treat her differently than it treated her white classmates. required stealing innocence in the name of survival. Monica told her mother about watching Kamala be stopped, and her mother nodded with the weary recognition of someone who'd been stopped herself countless times. They didn't need to discuss whether it was racial profiling. That was obvious. They discussed instead what Monica should do about it, whether she should speak up or stay quiet, whether risking her job was worth the symbolic gesture. Her mother said, "Baby, you do what you need to do to survive. Nobody can fault you for that." But Monica heard the thing her mother didn't say. Survival and dignity sometimes require different choices, and black folks are constantly forced to choose between them. James told his roommate, another young black man, about being followed in the electronics section. His roommate shared his own recent story, being stopped outside a pharmacy, accused of shoplifting, searched in full view of other customers who pretended not to see. They traded stories like war veterans comparing scars, laughed the bitter laugh of people who've learned to find humor in hurt because the alternative is drowning in rage. "Man, I'm so tired," James said finally. "I know. Like, soul tired, you know? I know." They sat in that knowing silence, that shared exhaustion that doesn't need explanation between people who live the same reality. This is the weight Black Americans carry, not just the incidents themselves, the stops, the follows, the suspicions, the accusations, but the cumulative burden of processing them, explaining them, teaching children about them, warning friends about them, carrying them in bodies that remember even when minds try to forget. The weight of knowing that tomorrow will bring more, that next week will add to the collection, that this is not a problem with a solution, but a condition of existence. The weight of watching white friends and co-workers move through the world without this burden, watching them shop without being followed, enter spaces without being questioned, make mistakes without those mistakes being attributed to their entire race. The weight of knowing that no amount of education or success or excellence will exempt you from suspicion, that Kamala Harris could be who she is and still get stopped, that James could be a straight-A student heading to college and still get followed, that Monica could be working toward nursing school and still watch herself be surveilled. The weight of performance, of having to be twice as good, 3 times as careful, constantly monitoring your own behavior to avoid giving anyone an excuse to treat you as you'll be treated anyway. The weight of decision fatigue, of calculating every interaction, measuring every risk, determining whether this particular incident is worth fighting or whether you should save your energy for the next one, or the one after that, or the inevitable one next week. The weight of emotional labor, of explaining racism to people who benefit from it, educating white friends who don't understand, answering the same questions over and over with patience you don't feel because anger is dangerous in black bodies. The weight of memory, of carrying not just your own incidents but your parents' incidents, your grandparents' incidents, the historical incidents that created the conditions for today's incidents. The long chain of degradation stretching back through time, linking the woman stopped in a modern store, to the woman denied service at a segregated lunch counter to the woman sold on an auction block. Different forms. Same fundamental message. You are less than, you don't belong. Your humanity is conditional. And the weight of knowing that this burden is itself invisible to those who don't carry it. That people will question whether these incidents are really about race, whether you're being too sensitive, whether you're imagining patterns that don't exist, whether it's really that bad. The weight of having your reality denied while living it. Angela tucked Maya into bed that night, kissed her forehead, whispered affirmations about her worth and beauty and brilliance. But in the privacy of her own room afterward, Angela wept. Wept for her daughter's stolen innocence. Wept for the conversations they'd have to keep having. Wept for the incidents Maya would experience that Angela couldn't prevent. Wept for the weight she was passing down, because it wasn't hers to put down. Monica got home from her shift and sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment complex. Sat in the dark, too tired to go inside, too exhausted to process another day of witnessing harm and doing nothing. She thought about Kamala's $800 protest. Thought about the power in that gesture and the privilege required to make it. Thought about all the people who couldn't afford such statements, who had to swallow indignity because they needed the products more than they needed the satisfaction of protest. Thought about herself, swallowing indignity daily because she needed the paycheck more than she needed to speak truth. The weight settled deeper. James lay in bed scrolling through his phone, seeing stories of other black people stopped, followed, accused, killed. Seeing the pattern repeat across the country, across the world, across history. Seeing himself in every story. Seeing his future in every incident. Seeing the weight he'd carry for the rest of his life unless something fundamental changed in America. He turned off his phone, stared at the ceiling, felt the exhaustion in his bones. Tomorrow he'd wake up, would navigate the world carefully, would perform innocence, would carry the weight, would add new incidents to the collection, would survive another day in a country that made survival itself an act of resistance. This was the truth that didn't fit in spreadsheets or policy manuals, the human cost that Jennifer's reports never calculated, the reality that David's career advancement ignored, the system's real expense, paid daily by people whose receipts never got filed, whose accounts never got audited, whose burdens never appeared in anyone's quarterly review. The weight was invisible to those who didn't carry it, but it was crushing those who did. Some burdens you inherit, some weights you can't put down, and some exhaustion runs so deep it lives in the bones. 6 months passed. The seasons changed. The store put up new promotional displays, ran different sales, hired new employees to replace the ones who quit or got fired or found better opportunities. Marcus was gone. He'd lasted another 3 months after the incident with Kamala. 3 months of watching monitors and following customers and feeling the weight of questions he couldn't silence. One day he simply didn't show up for his shift, didn't call, didn't explain. Just disappeared into whatever life he built away from uniforms and surveillance and the daily compromise of conscience. The store hired another guard, younger, less questioning, more willing to follow protocols without examining what those protocols really meant. The pattern continued. David got promoted, regional manager now overseeing 15 stores instead of 1. His success story, reducing shrinkage, improving metrics, implementing best practices, made him valuable to corporate. They didn't ask how he'd achieved those numbers, didn't question whose dignity had been sacrificed on the altar of profit margins. He moved to a bigger office, made more money, carried less doubt. Jennifer got promoted too. VP became SVP. More stores under her influence, more policies bearing her name, more people affected by decisions she made from offices that got higher and more distant with each advancement. She still hadn't read that article her friend sent. It remained in her messages, a small, uncomfortable reminder she scrolled past daily. Monica finished her nursing school applications, got accepted, started classes full-time, which meant quitting retail. On her last day, she walked through the store one final time, seeing it with the clarity that comes from leaving. Saw the cameras positioned to watch certain aisles more closely than others. Saw the managers exchange glances when certain customers entered. Saw the whole machinery of discrimination disguised as loss prevention. She left without saying goodbye to anyone, just turned in her badge and walked out. Started a new chapter where she'd help people instead of watching them be hurt. But she carried the memories, would always carry them. The faces of customers stopped, questioned, humiliated while she scanned their items and stayed quiet. The accumulation of witnessed injustice that she'd been powerless or too afraid to interrupt. James finished his degree, got a job, moved to a different city, thought maybe a change of location would mean a change of experience. But the first time he walked into a store in his new city, security followed him. Different city, different store, different guard. Same pattern, same exhaustion. He'd learned to expect it now, to prepare for it, to move through commercial spaces with the defensive awareness of someone who knows he's being watched. The weight had become familiar. Not lighter, just familiar. And Kamala, she kept living, kept shopping, kept navigating America as a black woman with resources and recognition and the same vulnerability to suspicion as anyone else with her skin tone. That $800 statement she'd made? The store forgot about it within a week. Corporate never heard about it. The only people who remembered were the ones who'd been there, witnesses to a moment of resistance that couldn't stop a system. She'd kept the receipt, though, filed it away with others, not as evidence for any legal claim, but as personal documentation, proof that it had happened, that she'd been there, that she'd refused to disappear quietly into the statistics of unmemorable humiliations. Sometimes she looked at it and felt powerful, felt like she'd done something meaningful, made a statement that mattered. Other times she looked at it and felt tired, felt like she'd spent $800 proving a point to people who hadn't cared enough to learn it. Both feelings were true. Resistance and exhaustion weren't opposites. They were companions traveling together through the landscape of Black American life. The store still stood on the same corner, still opened at 8 and closed at 9. Still welcomed customers with automatic doors and fluorescent lights, and the promise that anyone's money was good here. But anyone came with conditions, came with surveillance for some and freedom for others, came with suspicion for some and service for others. Nothing had fundamentally changed. Policies remained the same. Training continued using the same materials. New guards learned the same protocols. New managers climbed the same ladder. New corporate executives made the same calculations. The system perpetuated itself because systems don't change from individual resistance. They change from collective action, from policy reform, from people in power choosing justice over profit. And those in power were comfortable, so the pattern repeated. Day after day, month after month, year after year. Different people, different stores, different cities, same fundamental reality. Black customers watched, white customers oblivious, employees complicit or consciously silent, managers advancing, executives extracting. The machinery of American commerce grinding forward on the friction of racial bias, lubricated by the silence of those who benefit, and the exhaustion of those who suffer. What remains, after all the incidents and conversations and calculations and compromises? The truth remains. The lived reality of moving through America in black skin, the daily navigation of spaces that welcome your money but question your presence, the constant performance of innocence to justify your existence. The exhaustion remains, soul-deep and generational, passed down from parents to children along with the survival strategies and the warnings and the weight. The pattern remains, will keep remaining until something fundamental shifts in how America sees blackness, values dignity, distributes the presumption of innocence. The people remain, some scarred, some strengthened, all changed by the accumulation of incidents that individually seem small, but collectively form the landscape of racial discrimination in modern America. And the question remains, how long? How many more incidents? How many more generations? How much more weight must be carried before the people who built this system decide to dismantle it? The store doesn't answer, just keeps its doors open, keeps its cameras running, keeps watching some people more than others, keeps extracting profit from the very people it surveys. And somewhere, today, right now, another black person is walking into another store, is touching products they might purchase, is being watched by security who sees threat instead of customer, is adding another incident to the collection, is carrying the weight we all carry in a country that profits from that burden without acknowledging its existence. The pattern continues. The question remains, and we all remain. Witnesses, victims, perpetrators, or silent beneficiaries of a system that was built this way and stays this way because changing it would require something America hasn't yet chosen to give. The willingness to value black dignity as much as white comfort. The courage to dismantle profitable discrimination. The honesty to see the pattern and name it clearly. Until then, we remain. Carrying weight, collecting incidents, surviving in a country that makes survival itself a form of resistance. Some wounds never fully heal. Some weights never get lighter. But some truths can't stay buried in silence.